rigged panel and a weaponized clip, carefully edited to destroy her. Across from her looms Judge Gerald Whitman, a 37-year titan of the federal bench. Armed with arrogance, dripping with disdain, and hiding financial secrets that could shake the very foundation of the judiciary. But Jasmine doesn't flinch. She lets the silence stretch like a blade, then opens a single folder, and in just 90 seconds, turns a nationally televised ambush into the most devastating exposure of judicial corruption in years. What did she reveal? So explosive, so undeniable, it made a federal judge stutter and froze millions in absolute, breathless silence. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the sleek, high-gloss studio of Justice in Focus, everything gleamed with calculated perfection. But behind the glow, a trap had been set. Jasmine Crockett had been invited under the banner of civil discourse, her name framed in gold across promotional clips. The network promising an even-handed national conversation between seasoned voices of justice. But Jasmine wasn't naive. She'd felt it from the moment her assistant showed her the contract. Tight time slots, no access to segment questions, and an ominous live audience clause buried in fine print. Still, she came. Because when you've stood in courtrooms where silence can be deadlier than bullets, you don't back down from lights and cameras. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that just 5 minutes before airtime, producers would broadcast a doctored video from 2018. A heated floor debate taken wildly out of context, clipped to make her look like she supported defunding veterans programs. The clip rolled as if it were breaking news. No disclaimer, no chance to respond. Just gasps from the studio audience and a camera slowly panning to the empty chair reserved for Jasmine Crockett, framing her as guilty before she had even walked in. When Jasmine finally stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Not out of respect, but calculation. The lighting above her wasn't warm and flattering like for the judge's side. It was surgical and cold, casting harsh shadows beneath her eyes. The host, once a White House communications director under a Republican administration, offered a smirk dressed as neutrality. Her microphone had been turned down 2 decibels lower than the judge's. The teleprompter script, unknown to her, contained phrasing like controversial, volatile, and disgraced, all prefacing her name. She could feel the tension from the front row, corporate execs in suits, eyes gleaming not with curiosity, but with hunger for scandal. It wasn't a conversation. It was a media execution with commercial breaks. She was meant to unravel, to lash out, to confirm the version of her they had just fed to millions. But what they didn't understand was that Jasmine had walked into far worse arenas before, and she knew exactly how to weaponize silence, evidence, and timing like a blade. But just as Jasmine adjusted to the battlefield disguised as a stage, the real strike walked in, draped in authority and wrapped in applause. Federal Judge Gerald Whitman entered not like a guest, but like a ruling monarch surveying his courtroom from above. Every step he took was deliberate, weighted with entitlement, as if the floor had been laid for him alone. The lights shifted subtly to highlight his arrival, casting a soft gold aura around him while leaving Jasmine in stark white glare, like predator and prey caught in separate frames of the same film. The applause didn't come from admiration. It was manufactured, queued up by studio handlers, eager to inject power into the atmosphere. His suit, a custom charcoal ensemble with hand-stitched lapels, gleamed under the studio beams. The man carried no notes, no documents, just arrogance woven into posture, his eyes glinting with the cold assurance of someone used to watching others fold. As he sat across from Jasmine, he didn't acknowledge her presence, not with a nod, not with a glance. He adjusted his tie, folded his hands, and turned to the host like Jasmine wasn't even there. Then, with a smile that was all edge and no warmth, he launched the first missile. "Before we begin," he said, voice like crushed velvet laced with ice, "can someone clarify for me the purpose of inviting a former congresswoman, no longer in office, to speak on constitutional integrity?" No preamble, no courtesy, just surgical detonation. The camera slowly panned to Jasmine, but not to give her a platform, to study her reaction, to catch her flinch. She didn't give them one. Her jaw held firm, her eyes still. Whitman wasn't done. He leaned slightly forward, theatrically, like a man dishing out hard truths to a misled child. Ms. Crockett, you had your time in public service. That time expired. The voters spoke. They closed that chapter. And yet here you are, seated across from a federal judge, insisting you still speak for the American people? Each phrase was crafted not for intellectual debate, but to humiliate. He didn't challenge her ideas. He challenged her right to exist in the room. His tone was that of a gatekeeper guarding the sanctity of law from what he implied was an unqualified intruder. The host nodded solemnly, subtly validating the insult by moving on as if nothing outrageous had just been said. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Whitman mistook that for weakness, like many before him had. But what he failed to notice was the subtle shift in the air, the way the silence around Jasmine was not submissive, but strategic. She was not retreating. She was letting him dig the hole himself, inch by inch, with every syllable soaked in superiority. He thought he was building a case. What he was building was a collapse. He thought he was building a case. What he was building was a collapse. Jasmine didn't meet his words with words. She met them with stillness, one of those rare, piercing silences that doesn't seek permission to dominate a room. The air seemed to constrict as she sat motionless, not defensive, not afraid, just calculating. Her posture remained unshaken, her eyes fixed not on Whitman, not on the host, but on the folder beside her. It was off-white, clean, with a single brass clip at the top. A folder that didn't scream but whispered, "I know more than you think." And then with the kind of deliberate grace that rewrites a room's rhythm, she reached for it. One motion, smooth, no drama. But the silence that followed was deafening. No camera crew shifted, no audience member coughed. No host dared interrupt. It was like someone had drained the oxygen, and all anyone could do was watch. She placed the folder gently on the polished glass desk, aligning it perfectly with the table's edge, and flicked it open. The studio lights caught the pale shimmer of the first page as she slid it forward. Not to read, but simply to let it exist. Not one headline, not one quote, just crisp print in the weight of context, something that couldn't be edited into a clip. It wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't even a response. It was evidence, and it demanded silence. Whitman's earlier grin didn't vanish outright. It fractured, hairline cracks forming in real time as he tried to process the shift he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't playing defense. She was setting the stage for a prosecution, one sheet at a time. What made it more devastating was that Jasmine never sped up. She moved like a woman in control of every heartbeat in the room. She didn't apologize for taking her time. She owned it. The host glanced nervously at the teleprompter, realizing Jasmine had just hijacked the pace of a show designed to humiliate her. The producers had written a script, hot, reactive, designed for outbursts and viral meltdowns. But what they got was the opposite. A woman who'd turned stillness into spectacle and silence into dominance. She hadn't raised her voice once. But somehow, in less than 60 seconds, Jasmine Crockett had made the judge, the host, and the entire studio feel exactly what it's like to sit in front of a loaded file they never expected to see open, live. She hadn't raised her voice once. But somehow, in less than 60 seconds, Jasmine Crockett had made the judge, the host, and the entire studio feel exactly what it's like to sit in front of a loaded file they never expected to see opened, live. And now, with the room's oxygen stripped bare, she began to speak. Not fast, not emotional, but with a slowness that cut deeper than outrage ever could. Jasmine slid the first page from the folder and held it flat between her fingers, lifting it toward the studio cameras with the calm authority of someone who had already rehearsed this moment 100 times, not in front of a mirror, but in her bones. "Let's begin with something simple," she said, her voice low but sharp, each syllable carved with intention. "A contract." On the overhead monitor behind them, the image flickered to life, a scanned PDF, faint creases visible where it had once been folded in thirds. It was a legal agreement dated May 6th, from 3 years prior. At the top, in all caps, Halcyon Tech Group, Inc. Beneath that, bolded text, Retain Counsel, Whitman and Associates, PLLC. The camera zoomed in on the signature. It was clean, unmistakable, and elegantly cruel. Gerald E. Whitman. Jasmine didn't glance at the host. She didn't spare the audience a single look. Her eyes were locked on Whitman, who was no longer smirking, no longer seated like a man orchestrating a televised lesson. He was frozen, too proud to look away, too stunned to interrupt. You provided legal counsel, Jasmine continued, to Halcyon Tech while serving as managing partner of your firm. That alone isn't illegal. But what's curious, she turned the page slowly, almost reverently, is what happened after you took the bench. She laid out the next document, this time a financial transaction record. It had the feel of something ripped from a federal indictment. 3 highlighted rows with red boxes drawn around them. Dates, amounts, destinations. 3 transfers, she said, each word precise and deliberate. 100,000, then 250,000, then 200,000, all originating from Halcyon's executive fund, all routed through a shell company, Lancer Holdings International, before landing in a domestic trust titled Whitman Family Holdings, LLC. On the screen, the document magnified. The wire codes matched. The dates were damning. The final transfer had cleared just 48 hours after Whitman's courtroom ruled, unanimously and with alarming speed, in Halcyon's favor during a multi-million-dollar federal liability suit. This money, Jasmine said, pausing to let the words breathe, didn't arrive by coincidence. It arrived like payment. The host shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. Someone offstage murmured into an earpiece. The camera operator hesitated, then slowly pulled focus toward Whitman's face. Tense, pale, blinking faster now. Still, Jasmine didn't waver. She lifted the third document. A 2-page form, simple but fatal. A mandatory financial disclosure for all federal judges, signed under penalty of perjury. The page looked ordinary to the untrained eye, until Jasmine flipped to the back and circled in thick red ink the absence of one specific line: offshore assets. This, she said, holding it up like a final verdict, is your official disclosure filed with the Judicial Ethics Office last September. According to this, you claim 0 offshore financial interests. She let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2, 3, and then, and yet, she added, sliding forward a notarized deed of title, this Cayman Islands property, registered under a holding account with a matching family trust ID, tells a very different story. The screen split into 2. On the left, the financial disclosure, signed by Whitman. On the right, the luxury property deed, registered in Grand Cayman, matched to Whitman's wife's name, but funded through the same LLC shown in the wire transfer. The camera zoomed in on the matching tax ID numbers. Jasmine didn't need to say the word fraud. It was already written across every detail, now glowing under the lights. Whitman tried to speak. He opened his mouth, his throat tightening with disbelief. But nothing came. Not a denial, not a demand. Just silence, caught in the teeth of a woman who had just turned his past into a weapon. Jasmine leaned back slightly, not smug, not vindictive, just resolved. Her next words were almost too calm. You asked earlier what gave me the right to be here, she said. But the better question is, what gave you the right to judge anyone? While hiding everything you were being paid to forget? The host inhaled to interrupt, but stopped. There was nowhere to go. No commercial break could wash this out. The studio, which had been built to humiliate Jasmine, now became a courtroom without a gavel, and the gavel was in her hands. And through it all, she never once raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had the truth. And the truth didn't yell. It revealed. She had turned their trap into a courtroom. But now from the far edge of the broadcast stage, another figure stepped forward. One who had lived behind the curtain of Judge Whitman's empire and was finally ready to tear it down. The sound came first. A pair of heels, slow, steady, clicking against the polished concrete floor behind the cameras. At first, no one turned. The audience was frozen, all eyes glued to the screen, still split in half. Vittman's unsigned Cayman disclosure on one side, Jasmine's damning evidence on the other. The judge had not moved. His hands were clenched in his lap now, his eyes unfocused, his expression lost somewhere between disbelief and dread. Then the camera cut. She appeared from stage left, graceful, unshaken. Not part of the show, yet suddenly the centerpiece. Her hair was silver, pinned tightly back in a judicial-style twist. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no political pins. Just a navy blue blazer and a pair of worn brown shoes that told you she hadn't come to perform. She had come to testify. A producer's voice cracked in the studio booth. "Who the hell is that?" But it was too late. The audience gasped. Whitman finally looked up, and in that instant, the room understood. He knew exactly who she was. She walked to the center of the stage without hesitation, clutching a worn manila folder against her side like a final piece of unfinished business. Jasmine didn't turn to greet her. She didn't need to. She simply slid her folder aside, making space on the glass table for something even heavier than evidence: memory. The woman stepped beside Jasmine. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly into camera 2, the close-up lens trained on the table. Her voice was soft, but the weight behind it could break concrete. "My name is Judith Callahan. I served as chief clerk for the Honorable Judge Gerald Whitman from 2011 to 2022. No host had introduced her. No lower third banner appeared on the screen. She didn't need one. The silence she commanded did all the work. I managed his court calendar, his briefings, the scheduling of all civil litigation that passed through Chambers 3. She continued, voice steady, breath controlled. And I was the last person to see every file before it reached his desk. She opened the manila folder, hands precise, methodical, and drew out a single page, then placed it beneath the overhead projector. The studio screen responded instantly. It was an internal memo, dated, time-stamped, her initials on the top right corner. The subject line read, "Request to prioritize Halcyon V, Placer County, Chambers Directive." The camera zoomed in. Below, in short handwritten instruction: fast-track pre-trial to summary judgment, expedite docket slot. The handwriting matched previous samples from Whitman. A quiet tremor ran through the crowd. The memo didn't shout corruption, but it whispered complicity. "I received memos like this more than once," Judith said. "They always involved companies with prior links to the judge's former law firm or to accounts connected to Whitman Family Holdings. I followed orders because I thought it wasn't my place to question a federal judge." She stopped and looked directly at Whitman. He didn't meet her eyes. "But it is our place," she said. "All of us. Especially when silence becomes the shield that lets people like him operate without accountability." The host finally tried to interrupt, his voice brittle. "Ms. Callahan, are you saying Judge Whitman knowingly requested case prioritization for firms with financial connections to him?" She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "I'm saying he made those requests. I'm saying I complied. And I'm saying I was wrong to stay silent." The screen behind her changed again. More memos, more scheduling flags, all linking high-value corporate litigation to preferential docketing under Whitman's command. But it wasn't just the documents that hit. It was the tone in Judith's voice. Not anger, not revenge. Something far deeper. Conscience. "I came here today not because someone asked me to," she continued. "Not because I want attention, but because I watched this show live last week. I saw how Judge Whitman mocked Representative Crockett. I saw how the media framed her as angry, emotional, unqualified, because that's what people like him do when their power is threatened by the truth." The audience leaned in. Even the camera crew had gone still. Judith took a long, slow breath, then delivered the line that no one in the building would ever forget. "I may be retired, I may not wear the robe, but I am still a citizen, and I choose loyalty to the truth, not to the man who sat behind the bench." The words didn't echo. They detonated. Whitman's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. He reached for a glass of water that wasn't there. Jasmine hadn't moved once, and Judith Callahan. She placed the final document on the table, gently closed her folder, and stepped back into silence, not needing applause, not seeking permission, just walking off the set. Having told the truth, the system never expected her to speak aloud, and now that system was cracking. Judith Callahan's final words didn't echo. They settled. Heavy, final. And in that silence, all the illusions Wittmann had cloaked himself in began to dissolve. He sat there for a moment, frozen. The sharp, polished authority he had wielded just 15 minutes earlier was now crumbling in real time, before cameras, under lights, and in front of millions. His hands shifted on the desk, unsure of where to rest. His eyes darted, not in defiance but in search of something he no longer had: control. Then, like a man waking from a nightmare he didn't realize was real, Wittmann cleared his throat. This is ridiculous, he said, voice thinner than anyone expected. You people, you don't know what you're doing. His words came out staccato, grasping for structure, for safety. This entire spectacle has been manipulated, politically motivated. He gestured broadly, as if waving off the piles of damning documents laid bare beside Jasmine Crockett. His voice cracked again, this time on the word political, as though even his larynx refused to cooperate with the lie. He shifted in his seat. Sweat glinted just beneath his brow. He tried to chuckle, but it came out dry. Laughter stripped of confidence. You think this is justice? You're being used, all of you. This is a staged ambush, a left-wing media circus designed to humiliate me in public. His voice climbed a pitch too high, veering into desperation. There are protocols, due process. This isn't how these things are handled. I'm a federal judge. But no one answered. The host stared forward, pale. The audience remained motionless. Even the camera operators had stopped adjusting focus. The only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of electrical equipment and Wittmann's shallow, panicked breathing. He turned finally to Jasmine Crockett, the woman he had mocked, underestimated, and tried to destroy with clipped sound bites and calculated disrespect. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply met his gaze, not with triumph, but with the serene steadiness of someone who had nothing left to prove. And that was what unmoored him the most. Wittmann reached for one of the documents in front of him, as if hoping to somehow reinterpret it mid-broadcast, but his hand trembled. These records are incomplete, he mumbled. There are explanations, context. You're painting a false narrative. This is bigger than me. He said it like an accusation, but it landed like an admission. And then, from behind the dark curtains at stage right, came the sound that broke everything. Two firm, synchronized sets of footsteps. Crisp, measured, purposeful. Wittmann looked toward the sound instinctively, and when he saw the two men emerging, both in tailored black suits, both wearing federal credentials clipped to their belts, his posture shifted like a collapsing tower. No one announced them. They didn't need it. Their presence was the announcement. They moved without showmanship, without urgency. One of them, the taller of the two, walked up beside Wittmann's chair and bent slightly to whisper in his ear. No one else heard the words, but the audience saw the effect. Wittmann's face went pale. He whispered back, something shaky, unintelligible. But the agent calmly straightened, gave a short nod, and placed a light hand on Wittmann's shoulder. Not a forceful grab, just enough to remind him of the weight of the law behind it. I want to make a statement, Wittmann said suddenly, voice hoarse. You can't do this. Not on live television. He stood wobbly. This is unlawful. This is a travesty. His words fell into the air like broken glass, sharp but useless. The shorter agent stepped beside him now, guiding him from the side. The two agents began to walk him toward the back of the stage, one on each side. There were no handcuffs. No cuffs were necessary. His posture said more than shackles ever could. As he passed the front row of the audience, one woman pressed a hand to her lips. A man closed his eyes. A younger viewer simply stared, frozen. No one cheered. No one clapped. No one smirked. Because what had just unfolded was not entertainment. It was exposure. And the silence in the studio now wasn't awkward. It was sacred. The cameras kept rolling, and for a few seconds the broadcast offered no words. Just the image of a man who once sat at the pinnacle of legal power, being walked away from the very institution he'd tried to weaponize. He reached the curtain, And just before vanishing into shadow, he turned once more. This time not to plead, but to look back at the seat he once ruled from. It was empty now, lit by studio lights, framed by truth, and it would never belong to him again. Whitman vanished behind the black curtain, but the silence he left didn't vanish with him. It metastasized through the control room, across the newsroom, and into every glowing screen across America. The moment didn't end when he exited stage left. In fact, that's when it truly began. The producers had no choice but to keep the cameras rolling. Every second of the live stream, every flicker of Whitman's unraveling, every line from Judith Callahan, and every silent page Jasmine laid down was captured in raw, uncut detail. The broadcast ended not with credits, but with stunned silence. Then a hard cut to emergency news anchors fumbling to summarize what the nation had just witnessed. But they were already too late. Within minutes, the internet ignited. The clip, just over 9 minutes long, began circulating under one instruction: watch. It started with political accounts, then legal forums, then journalists, then universities. By the time the East Coast was halfway through dinner, the footage had spread through every major online platform and television screen. No commentary could contain it, no spin could control it, and no one could unsee it. It wasn't just what Jasmine said, it was how she didn't say it. The restraint, the silence, the surgical exposure of fact without fury, the ivory folder, the overhead camera. The moment she slid the Cayman Islands document under the lens without speaking a word, and the room collapsed under the weight of what it revealed. Clips were cut, recut, replayed endlessly. One widely shared post showed Jasmine mid-turn toward the screen, her expression composed and steady, with the caption, "This is how you end a legacy, with proof, not noise." On legal discussion boards, former prosecutors, sitting judges, and law professors chimed in like jurors finally unshackled. Professor Elaine Raskin from Yale Law School posted, "What Jasmine Crockett just did isn't just brave. It's a masterclass in legal exposure under pressure. This will be taught." Her comment was reposted thousands of times within hours. An hour later, Stanford Law Professor Emeritus Derek Hanley weighed in live on a national news program. "We just watched something we don't often get in American legal history: accountability in real time. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended the credibility of the bench itself by tearing off the mask." This is, without exaggeration, the kind of moment that reshapes public trust. Clips from that interview were embedded into law school seminars by the end of the week. Students who'd only known Jasmine Crockett from headlines were now analyzing her approach in constitutional law classes, studying not just her strategy, but her stillness. In comment sections and student groups, people who hadn't known what a judicial disclosure form was on Monday were quoting procedural ethics by Friday. "This wasn't theater," one law clerk wrote. "It was justice rendered live, by someone who knew when to stay silent and when to strike." Memes appeared almost instantly, but these weren't the mocking kind. They carried a reverence. One image showed Jasmine holding the ivory folder like a sword. Another showed the judge's face mid-denial, paired with the phrase, "Power doesn't protect you from consequence." Television news struggled to keep up. On cable, analysts talked over each other, trying to frame the clip within familiar narratives. A few hosts floated theories that it was a coordinated setup, a trap. But even skeptics acknowledged the authenticity of the documents, the credibility of the witnesses, and the clarity of what had been revealed. In downtown Washington, D.C., a spontaneous panel gathered on a law school rooftop, organized by graduate students within hours of the broadcast. A projector replayed the moment Judith Callahan declared, "I choose loyalty to the truth, not the man who sat behind the bench." No one interrupted. No one laughed. The audience stood still. A former federal ethics officer in attendance leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "I've waited my whole career to see someone say that out loud." And Jasmine? She posted nothing. No statement, no comment, no camera phone response. The absence of her voice after the clip aired became its own message. Because now everyone understood. This wasn't about one moment on television. It wasn't about victory or revenge. It wasn't even about being right. It was about what happens when a woman walks into a media trap, is set up to lose, and calmly turns every camera, every mic, and every word against those who planned her fall, and does it not with volume, but with undeniable truth. Not theater, not spectacle, just evidence, presented under pressure with the kind of grace that makes institutions shake. As the nation digested the footage frame by frame, a second shockwave tore through the narrative. Not from the stage, not from Jasmine, but from inside the machine itself. Late into the night, while clips of Jasmine's quiet defiance still surged across networks and group chats, an anonymous whistleblower, an assistant segment producer only identified in news reports as LC, forwarded a string of internal emails to 3 investigative reporters. No subject line, just attachments. What they uncovered was not just unethical, it was engineered malice, typed in plain language and stamped with corporate logos. At the center of the leak was a single line in bold, written by a senior producer just 5 days before the broadcast. The email read, "The goal is simple. Rattle her, break her rhythm, and let her melt down on air. We need a viral moment. Make her the meme, not the message." The words hit like shrapnel. Cold, calculated, unmistakably racist, and horrifyingly familiar to anyone who'd ever been reduced to a caricature because of their skin, their voice, or their strength. Within hours, the documents were authenticated. The timestamps matched the pre-show scheduling logs. The sender was a longtime executive producer of the program, the same man who had introduced Jasmine Crockett that night with forced charm and artificial smiles. Other emails outlined talking points for the host, including directives to steer her into agitation and cut her mic if she monologues. One even attached a pre-cut sizzle reel of a past committee hearing where Jasmine had raised her voice against a hostile witness, edited to remove context and amplify emotion. The subject line? Use this to remind the audience who she really is. There was no ambiguity. The broadcast wasn't journalism. It was a setup, a psychological ambush designed to exploit stereotypes for ratings. And Jasmine had walked into it knowing none of this. The backlash erupted with volcanic force. Civil rights organizations issued coordinated statements within 12 hours. The National Black Lawyers Association condemned the network by name, calling it a modern digital lynching disguised as a panel show. The NAACP labeled it an orchestrated degradation of black female leadership. Legal advocacy groups, many of whom had stayed cautious during the earlier stages, now spoke with fire. Professor Mariah Bentley, a Harvard law scholar who rarely commented on media events, appeared live on PBS and delivered a searing statement. This wasn't just a broadcast. It was the weaponization of stereotype for commercial gain. They didn't expect her to stay calm because they didn't believe she was capable of it. And when she dismantled their trap in silence, they lost the mask. But now we see it. The public turned fast and hard. By morning, the program's sponsor list had dwindled by half. A cascade of advertisers pulled their support, citing ethical misalignment. Internally, multiple staffers resigned, including 2 associate producers and one of the camera operators, who released a short video on social media explaining that everything from the lighting to the teleprompter angles was calibrated to provoke her. An online petition demanding the show's cancellation surged past 1 million signatures in less than 36 hours. But the most damning blow came when a former co-host of the program, once seen as a staple of the network's political coverage, went on a rival outlet and confirmed it wasn't the first time. "I saw this pattern years ago. They invite voices like Jasmine's to appear neutral, but what they really want is the moment they can cut, clip, and ridicule. It's never about dialogue, it's about control." The atmosphere shifted from outrage to reckoning. Suddenly, every black woman who'd ever been talked over on a panel, every whistleblower dismissed for being too emotional, every truth teller edited down to a soundbite, they all had a name to anchor their pain to: Jasmine Crockett. Students began organizing viewings of the clip, not just as spectacle, but as study. What does it mean to be invited only to be destroyed? How do you maintain composure when every light, mic, and script has been loaded against you? Professors called it a case study in modern systemic targeting through broadcast. And still, Jasmine remained silent. No interviews, no social media post, No late-night talk show tour, because the facts were speaking louder than anything she could possibly say. And now the very industry that had tried to bait her into losing her temper was losing its grip on the narrative. Badly. A second leaked email surfaced 2 days later, this one from a network executive sent internally after Jasmine had already begun her quiet exposure on air. It read, "She's not breaking. We need to pivot, redirect to Wittmann's experience, remind the audience of his legacy." But the audience had already made up its mind. They'd seen what she faced, and more importantly, they'd seen how she didn't flinch. The demand for justice didn't end when the camera stopped rolling. It began. What Jasmine Crockett had ignited on live television, the silent surgical dismantling of Judge Wittmann's facade, became more than a viral moment. It cracked open a door the public didn't even know had been locked. And what lay behind it was darker than anyone wanted to believe. A judiciary with unchecked power, financial entanglements, and no mechanism for real accountability. Within 48 hours, a coalition of civil rights groups and public transparency organizations launched an unprecedented joint appeal. The names behind the letter read like a war roster for truth: the American Civil Liberties Union, the Brennan Center, the National Black Lawyers Association, Public Citizen, Judicial Integrity Now. Their language was uncompromising. "We call for a full federal audit of every sitting judge's assets, domestic and offshore. This includes family trusts, third-party investments, undeclared conflicts, and historical case outcomes influenced by private interest. If judges are to wield justice, they must not hide from it." The petition reached 1 million signatures in less than a week. It wasn't just lawyers and legal scholars signing. It was veterans, nurses, students, single mothers, small business owners. The public had seen what unchecked power looked like, and they were ready to pull the curtain back on every black robe in America. News anchors no longer opened with sports or overseas updates. They opened with this: how deep does the corruption go? A nationwide survey revealed 62% of Americans no longer trusted the federal judiciary to act impartially. Legal podcasts surged in downloads. Public radio stations aired anonymous whistleblower accounts from inside district courts. One former judicial assistant told NPR, "I watched my judge approve a ruling on a case involving a corporation whose CEO funded his daughter's wedding, and no one batted an eye." As pressure mounted, America's top law schools did something they had never done before. They united. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, Howard, and Berkeley announced a joint emergency symposium, broadcast live and free to the public, titled "Justice and Shadow Power: Where is the Line?" The title alone set the internet ablaze. Commentators debated it. Memes were made. But underneath the cultural noise, something serious was brewing. The symposium was to be held at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. A deliberate choice. The very building where landmark legal arguments were once crafted would now be the arena for their dissection. The day of the event, the steps outside Constitution Hall were packed before sunrise. Not just academics, veterans in wheelchairs, young activists with notebooks, old civil rights leaders with trembling hands. The air buzzed like a revolution trying to remember its name. Inside, the banners were unmissable. The robe is not immunity. Accountability is not disrespect. Justice cannot exist in the shadows. The keynote speaker, Professor Nia Barrett of Howard University, stood beneath blinding stage lights and delivered a statement that felt like thunder through the marble hall. When judges are not required to be transparent, justice becomes a commodity. When power is unmonitored, it mutates into abuse. Today we ask not for revenge, but for clarity, not for spectacle, but for safeguards. And we demand it not as citizens alone, but as the last line between democracy and decay. Her speech was followed by panels composed of whistleblower judges in silhouette, law students reading leaked clerk memos, ethicists showing graphs of case rulings versus known political donors. Every 15 minutes, another layer peeled back. Real estate gifts, unreported income, rulings delivered in under 30 seconds without trial. Then came the moment that shattered the air. A 19-year-old law student from Spelman College stood up during Q&A. Her voice was clear, her tone unshaking. If Jasmine Crockett hadn't exposed this live on TV, how long would Judge Whitman have continued? How many more would have fallen under the weight of a system that doesn't fear being seen? The room went still. One by one, professors and judges, some shaking with emotion, rose to sign a new charter drafted by the Symposium Committee, the Covenant for Transparent Justice. Its demands were bold but precise: independent oversight of all federal judges by a publicly accountable body. Real-time, publicly accessible financial disclosures. Mandatory recusal enforcement tied to algorithmic conflict flagging systems. Term limits for lifetime appointments or, at minimum, performance reviews every 7 years. The charter was sent that same night to every sitting senator and representative. No one left the hall cheering. They left electrified, ashamed, ready. And though Jasmine Crockett said nothing in the days that followed, her silence was deafening, not because it lacked meaning, but because it had already echoed in every institution now shaking. She hadn't just exposed one corrupt man, she had made the country question the temple he stood in. The world wanted to crown her, commercialize her defiance, and turn a courtroom reckoning into a media campaign. But Jasmine Crockett refused to let the truth she fought for become entertainment. The media frenzy didn't wait. It crashed in like a flood. Within 24 hours of the televised takedown, Jasmine Crockett's inbox overflowed. CNN, MSNBC, The View, HBO, even late-night comedy shows, each begging for a segment, an exclusive, a headline. Agents pitched six-figure book deals with ghostwriters already attached. A streaming platform offered to dramatize the courtroom moment, complete with an A-list actress who could capture Jasmine's fire. Fashion magazines wanted photo shoots. Universities proposed honorary degrees. Everyone wanted a piece of her, to elevate her as the next symbol of truth, of resilience, of defiant womanhood in the face of power. And yet, she said nothing. While the world tried to repackage her silence, Jasmine disappeared. No press releases, no interviews, no carefully curated PR statements. She retreated to her district, to her apartment 2 blocks from the community legal center she once interned at. Her team, those who knew her best, watched in stunned awe as she declined opportunity after opportunity. "You're walking away from the biggest moment of your life," one producer warned over voicemail. But Jasmine had seen too much manipulation, too many performances disguised as justice. She had no intention of letting the truth be diluted by applause. Behind closed doors, she reviewed every offer. She saw the language: exclusive rights, editorial control, public relations coordination. They didn't want her story. They wanted her likeness. And that, to Jasmine, was dangerous. Because if they could turn her into a brand, they could make others believe justice needed a perfect face, a spotlight, a microphone. That the only way to confront power was with millions watching. But Jasmine had faced the storm alone. No script, no PR team, just facts, courage, and a folder of truth. And she wanted others to know that was enough. The only message she allowed to escape came quietly, almost unintentionally. A handwritten letter from a 19-year-old pre-law student in Philadelphia had arrived at her office. The girl wrote about watching the hearing at a bus station, how she cried as Jasmine stayed composed under attack, how it made her believe for the first time that the law wasn't just for the rich and white and powerful. She ended the note with a question. "Do you feel proud of being a symbol now?" Jasmine read the letter 3 times. She didn't hand it off to a staffer. She didn't send a canned reply. She sat at her desk in a hoodie, no cameras in sight, and wrote back in ink that barely dried before she mailed it. The note was only 4 lines. "Symbols can't speak, but people can. I don't need to be remembered. I need others to feel safe doing what I did. That's how justice grows." The student, overwhelmed, shared it online. It was screenshotted, reposted, and dissected within hours. Social media lit up not because Jasmine had said something grand, but because she had refused to say anything that made her bigger than the cause. Commentators didn't know what to do with that. In a world where everyone chased virality, here was a woman who had gone viral and walked away from it. on purpose. Political strategists whispered that she was missing her moment. One network anchor said, "This is what happens when activists don't know how to transition to leadership." But they misunderstood Jasmine entirely. She didn't want to be a headline. She wanted to remain a warning shot, a reminder that truth doesn't always need a sequel, that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do after a revolution is step back and leave room for someone else to rise. In private, Jasmine returned to her roots. She visited classrooms in silence, sitting in the back row while students debated court ethics. She walked through her old neighborhood without security, stopping by a bodega whose owner had taped her face to the register like a trophy. She smiled, but she didn't linger. When asked for quotes, she only said, "Keep watching the courts. They count on you forgetting." Meanwhile, every declined invitation seemed to say something louder than a speech. By staying silent, Jasmine had shifted the narrative. She wasn't just the woman who exposed a federal judge. She was now the woman who taught the country how dangerous it is to chase justice as spectacle. And the more she refused the spotlight, the more powerful her shadow became. The silence wasn't passive, it was defiance, a choice, a refusal to let justice be sold back to the public as a Netflix trailer or a TikTok moment. Jasmine knew what they wanted: to crown her, commercialize her, then forget her once the ratings dipped. But instead, she chose to become something they couldn't control, a whisper that grew into thunder. She didn't disappear, she distanced. And in that distance, a message lingered: don't watch for me. Watch who they try to silence next. That, more than any award or standing ovation, would be her legacy. While Jasmine's silence echoed across the nation, in the chambers of Congress, the aftermath of her defiance began to harden into policy, and a new battle for transparency ignited. The air in the Capitol felt charged, thick with urgency, with consequence. It had been less than 3 weeks since the broadcast that shattered illusions about judicial neutrality, and already a bipartisan group of lawmakers was gathering signatures, readying podiums, and preparing to detonate the next bombshell. Not through a folder of leaked documents, but through legislation. They called it the Judicial Trust Act, and it was more than a bill. It was a direct shot across the bow of unchecked judicial power. The room was packed when the press conference began. Reporters, legal analysts, civil rights advocates, everyone sensed this wasn't just another hollow gesture meant to die in committee. This had momentum. At the center stood Representative Elijah Tatum, a veteran legislator known for quiet resolve rather than fiery speeches. But this time, he looked carved from stone, his voice taut with moral clarity. Cameras clicked as he held up a single sheet of paper and said, "This is not about politics. This is about the soul of our republic." Behind him stood an unlikely alliance: Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives, some holding folders, others clutching their talking points like shields. What united them wasn't ideology, but outrage. Outrage that a man in robes could sell verdicts behind closed doors and still demand the public call him honorable. The Judicial Trust Act, Tatum explained, would require every federal judge to publicly disclose their complete financial holdings, domestic and offshore, every gift, every consulting fee, every transaction made by spouses, children, or shell corporations tied to them. But the bill didn't stop there. It also required judges to disclose all personal relationships, professional, financial, or familial, with entities or firms appearing before their court. No more vague potential conflicts. No more "we trust their judgment." This time, trust would be earned, under penalty of law. Then came the quote that would echo across headlines that night and dominate news cycles for days. Tatum didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the podium. He simply looked into the camera and said, "If we do not oversee those who administer justice, then justice itself becomes a cloak, draped not to protect the innocent, but to conceal the machinery of power." It landed like a thunderclap. Within hours, the quote appeared on the chyron of every major network. Political anchors debated it, law schools printed it, protesters stenciled it onto banners. It didn't matter that it came from a politician. It felt like something sacred, something overdue. For decades, the judiciary had been seen as the last untainted branch of government. But now, with Jasmine's revelations still raw in the public's mind, the myth had shattered. And the people weren't just ready for change. They were demanding it. Opposition came fast and furious. Judicial lobbying groups condemned the bill as an overreach, a dangerous politicization, and a slippery slope toward dismantling judicial independence. One retired circuit judge claimed it would make judges live in fear of populist retaliation. But those words rang hollow, because for once the public wasn't reacting with apathy. They were watching. And the images of Gerald Whitman being escorted off live television weren't fading. If anything, they had become a symbol of what happens when oversight fails. More lawmakers joined the fray. Senator Laura Montrose, herself a former prosecutor, took the floor during a late-night session and read aloud a list of over 30 judges who had ruled on cases involving companies tied to their financial portfolios, with no disclosure. Her voice cracked when she reached the name of a judge who dismissed a wrongful death suit while owning over $300,000 in stock in the defendant's corporation. "This isn't independence," she spat. "It's legalized betrayal." Legal scholars, once cautious in tone, began penning essays with titles like "The Hidden Empire of the Robe" and "When Justice Becomes a Market." One even went viral for calling the judiciary America's most polite cartel. The debate spilled into dinner tables, classrooms, barbershops, and church pews. And every time someone asked, "Isn't this too extreme?" someone else would answer, "Then explain Whitman." As the bill made its way to committee, Jasmine's name was invoked repeatedly, but she remained silent. Her refusal to politicize her moment had given the legislation more weight, not less. She wasn't rallying votes or campaigning on talk shows, but her presence was felt in every room, her face etched behind every demand for reform. She had become, unwillingly, the conscience of a bill she never endorsed, but silently fueled. The Judicial Trust Act wasn't just a response. It was a reckoning, a statement that no robe, no gavel, no courtroom architecture would be allowed to mask corruption again. And as hearings loomed, as analysts prepared for a bitter legislative war, one truth rang louder than any lobbyist's objection. This time the system was on trial, and the country was watching, finally with both eyes open. As Congress debated legislation born from her silence, Jasmine quietly slipped out of the political spotlight and into a room where the next generation of justice was still learning how to speak. The university's law auditorium buzzed with the kind of electricity only youth and purpose can create. Rows of fresh faces, some nervous, others brimming with idealism, filled the red velvet seats, flipping through programs printed in gold ink. National Student Forum on Legal Ethics and Accountability. It had been a week since the Judicial Trust Act was introduced, and Jasmine Crockett's name had come up in every single workshop. Her televised confrontation, her refusal to cash in, her note to the Philadelphia student, her ghostly absence. The students had turned her into a myth, a case study, a rallying cry. They never expected her to show up in person. She didn't arrive in a motorcade, no entourage, no announcement. Jasmine walked in through a side door, wearing a simple dark coat, no makeup, and her hair pulled back into a soft knot. She quietly slipped into the last row, unnoticed at first. Her presence wasn't declared, it was discovered. A second-year student spotted her and froze mid-sentence. Then another. Then a wave of murmurs rippled forward, polite but electric, like the moment a courtroom realizes the judge has entered. But Jasmine didn't move. She nodded at the few who turned to look, smiled faintly, and kept her eyes on the stage. It was a panel discussion about judicial power and public trust, moderated by a nervous third year who clutched her index cards like they might dissolve. The students, diverse in race, gender, ambition, spoke with passion, but there was an undercurrent of self-doubt. Every example they cited came back to the same question. What happens when the law becomes the very instrument of silence? Then after the final applause, the moderator cleared her throat. Her hands trembled. She scanned the audience and said, "We've just been informed that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is in the room. If she would be willing, we'd be honored." All heads turned. A pause. A breath. Jasmine stood up slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood what it meant to carry weight without wielding it. As she stepped forward, a strange hush fell over the crowd. There were no cheers, no wild applause, just the kind of quiet reserved for something sacred. She walked up the side steps of the stage and didn't head for the podium. She stopped just beside it, hands at her sides. And then she said just one sentence. "I don't need to say more today. The way you act after you leave this room will be the most beautiful answer you could ever give." It hit like thunder, not because it was loud, but because it was everything. In that moment, Jasmine stripped away every illusion about speeches, symbols, or saviors. She placed the responsibility not on history or institutions or lawmakers, but on them, the students, the ones who still had time to choose who they would become. The silence after her words wasn't awkward, it was reverent. She gave a short nod, then stepped down from the stage, and she didn't linger. She walked straight back to her seat, even as the auditorium pulsed with the urge to rise, to clap, to chase her for photos or autographs. But somehow, everyone understood. This wasn't a photo op. This was a challenge, a dare, a transfer of moral weight, and no one wanted to cheapen it with noise. After the forum ended, a few students approached her, not with cameras, but with questions that mattered. One girl asked, "How do you speak truth to power when no one believes you yet?" Jasmine looked her in the eye and said, "You keep speaking until someone does. Then you help them speak louder than you ever could." Another asked, "How do you know when it's your fight?" Jasmine replied, "If you're awake at night thinking about it, it's already yours." Still, she refused to let the attention linger. She left the auditorium through the same side door she came in. But what she left behind wasn't just inspiration, it was combustion. Students who had been unsure of their voices now whispered about internships at watchdog organizations. Others Googled the Judicial Trust Act for the first time. One even stood in the hallway after she left and said, "I thought we were supposed to follow precedent, but maybe it's time we write our own." Later that night, video clips from the event began to circulate, not of Jasmine speaking, but of the room's reaction, the quiet, the stillness, the weight. A legal podcast called it the most powerful 19 seconds in the history of law student activism. News outlets didn't know how to spin it. There was no drama, no soundbite, just an act of restraint that sparked a revolution of resolve. And while Jasmine slept that night, her inbox filled again. This time, not with TV offers or book deals, but with letters from students, junior attorneys, even first-year paralegals. They didn't ask for autographs. They asked for reading lists, for strategies, for advice on staying calm when the courtroom turns cruel. And in each of those messages was something she had hoped for all along. A voice that didn't want to be her, a voice that wanted to be heard. Jasmine never followed up. She didn't send mass replies. She didn't repost screenshots. But in a locked drawer in her home office, she kept a folder of those letters. And on the front, written in her own handwriting, were the same words she'd once spoken into a microphone without a podium. The way they act after today will be the most beautiful answer. The students rose with new resolve, the chambers echoed with reform, and the headlines blazed with Jasmine's name. But beneath the fire, beneath the noise, lay something deeper. A lesson no camera could capture and no courtroom could contain. In a world increasingly addicted to volume, where shouting often replaces truth and scandal is sold faster than sincerity, Jasmine Crockett's defiance didn't come from outrage. It came from restraint, from the conviction that silence, when anchored in truth, can split stone. She had every reason to scream, to retaliate, to spit fire the moment the trap was sprung beneath the studio lights. But instead, she opened a folder. She let the silence stretch, and in doing so, she taught a generation that dignity isn't weakness. It's resistance in its sharpest form. What she endured was not just a media ambush. It was the modern-day crucible for every woman of color who dares speak without apology. The host had tried to box her in. The lighting crew dimmed her presence. The producers sharpened their knives through editing. But Jasmine refused to shrink. Not because she was fearless, but because she had finally understood. The moment you let their frame define your fight, you've already lost. Her courage wasn't loud, it was deliberate. And in a culture that rewards volume over value, that kind of control was nothing short of revolutionary. She didn't just expose corruption, she exposed complicity, the quiet hands behind the camera, the legal insiders who whispered warnings but never stood beside her, the academics who taught case law but never questioned who wrote it. She made them all visible, and that visibility is power, because once seen, injustice cannot be unseen. She shattered the illusion that justice is blind. She showed the world that sometimes it wears tailored robes and trades truth for personal gain. But the deepest lesson came not in the courtroom nor in the viral clips. It came in the moments after. When Jasmine turned down the book deals the agent offers, the celebrity platforms. When she told a student, "I don't need to be a symbol," that was her answer to the entire spectacle. Not fame, not martyrdom, but multiplication. She didn't want followers, she wanted mirrors, reflections of courage replicating across courtrooms, classrooms, boardrooms, anywhere power once counted on silence. And that is where the story shifted from personal vindication to public legacy. Because every institution that tried to break her had relied on one calculation, that she would react emotionally, lash out, lose control, become the meme they could mock and discard. But she didn't give them the ending they'd written. She rewrote the genre altogether. And in doing so, she changed not just how we see power, but how we respond to it. Not with rage alone, but with truth, delivered like a scalpel. The human lesson here is sharp and sobering. Integrity will not always reward you with applause. In fact, it often leaves you standing alone in a storm of doubt and distortion. Jasmine Crockett learned that firsthand. She lost her congressional seat. She was mocked, baited, betrayed, even by those who once claimed to be allies. But she stayed in the fire, and not to survive it, but to expose what was burning underneath. Her fight wasn't just about one judge. It wasn't just about one corrupted episode of televised sabotage. It was about every unseen hand that pulls the levers behind closed doors and counts on the public never asking why. Her battle was against the myth of objectivity used to conceal bias, against the systems that weaponize decorum to silence dissent, against the comfortable lie that injustice wears only one face. And yet, in the heart of that fire, she held on to something most never expect to survive battle: empathy. Jasmine never demanded vengeance. She never called for her enemies to be ruined. She simply exposed the truth and stepped back, because she knew the truth didn't need a spear, it needed light. And that is perhaps the most human lesson of all, that the most powerful justice does not roar, it reveals. She taught us that not all victories come in headlines. Some come in the eyes of a law student who decides to challenge a judge's ethics, in a producer who leaks an email because they've had enough, in a citizen who learns to ask, "Who profits from my silence?" She reminded us that dignity is a weapon, that silence, when chosen, is not surrender, it is strategy. That truth, no matter how long it is buried, waits for the brave to unearth it. And finally, most powerfully, that one voice, steady and unshaken in the face of design and deceit, can crack the most fortified halls of power. This is the legacy Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a slogan, not a brand, but a blueprint. A reminder that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be willing to stand. And as Jasmine stepped back into the quiet, leaving only the echo of her restraint and the tremor of her truth, one final question thundered louder than any gavel. What will we do now, when the silence is broken and the curtain has fallen? This isn't just a story to watch. It's a challenge to answer, because now we know the systems meant to protect justice can be manipulated, masked, bought, and exposed. Jasmine's stand wasn't a finale, it was an invitation. To students, question what you're taught. To voters, demand transparency from those who claim authority. To citizens, follow the money, not the slogans. To every silent witness who ever thought, this is just how power works, you were never powerless. The line has been drawn, the light has been turned on, and the next move is not hers, it's ours. So ask yourself, In a nation where truth barely survives the edit, will you be another viewer or the next voice that refuses to be framed? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Jasmine Crockett walked onto The View expecting a civil debate, but within 4 minutes, she was ambushed, mocked, and humiliated on live TV by Joy Behar and her co-hosts in front of 3 million Americans. What they didn't know was that every smirk, every insult, every scripted jab had been secretly documented, and 1 week later, an $800 million lawsuit would tear the curtain down on ABC's most protected empire. As advertisers flee and reputations crumble, Jasmine doesn't ask for revenge. She demands respect. A talk show becomes a courtroom. A smear becomes a scandal. And a setup becomes the most expensive mistake in daytime television history. How far did they go to break her? And why did they think she'd stay silent? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The overhead lights on the set of The View weren't just bright. They were clinical, almost surgical, as if designed to expose any flicker of vulnerability. Jasmine Crockett knew this wasn't just another guest appearance. It was a test, and not the kind she hadn't passed before. Dressed in a deep emerald suit that caught the light just enough to reflect strength without vanity, she sat with both feet flat on the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap. The camera panned. Polite applause rose from the audience, but behind the glass, the energy in the control booth was different, edgy, expectant. Producers leaned in close to their monitors. Someone whispered into a headset, "Stand by for segment 3. This is the one." Jasmine could feel it, not the anticipation of dialogue, but the quiet sharpening of knives. She had come to speak about policies that mattered: economic disenfranchisement in urban communities, healthcare deserts in rural counties, the deep racial disparities in maternal mortality. Instead, she was greeted with a smile edged in steel from Joy Behar, who turned ever so slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture like a veteran ready to pounce. Jasmine had barely finished her opening sentence. Something about the structural failures of post-pandemic economic recovery, when Joy cut in, laughter lurking in her tone. "Let's be honest here," Joy said, loud enough for the crowd to perk up. "Jasmine's got that good TV look. That's probably why she's here, right? I mean, no offense. But let's not pretend Trump was scouting for scholars." The audience chuckled, hesitant, unsure whether to laugh or brace. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they know they're not the one who should feel embarrassed. But the moment wasn't over. Sunny Hostin leaned in next, her voice softer but colder, calculated. "I just think we need to be honest about what's happening here," she said, directing her words not to Jasmine, but to the audience. "This isn't about policy, it's about packaging. Jasmine fits the moment. Young, black, camera ready. And that's fine. But let's not act like this is about qualifications. It's branding." There it was. The room didn't erupt. It sank. You could feel it. The air tighten, the invisible cord that holds civility in place suddenly straining. Jasmine sat upright, unmoving, but her eyes darkened. Her credentials were extensive. A law degree earned through years of sacrifice, a legislative record that spoke louder than any soundbite, and a career built not on image, but impact. But in less than 2 minutes, her life's work had been flattened into a stereotype, an accessory for political optics. The real blow came from Whoopi Goldberg. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. She crossed her arms slowly, leaned back in her chair like a judge, and said, "Let's just say what everyone's thinking. If it weren't for diversity initiatives, Jasmine wouldn't even be at this table. That's the truth." Silence. Not the kind that falls, but the kind that detonates. Even the audience, conditioned to clap and laugh on cue, hesitated. No cue card could fix that. The comment wasn't hidden behind innuendo. It was direct, flat, and devastating. It didn't question Jasmine's argument. It erased her right to have one. It didn't push back on her position. It delegitimized her entire presence. The implication was clear. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here because she earned it. She was here because someone needed a black woman to check a box. Jasmine inhaled slowly. The camera zoomed in. Sweat glistened faintly on her forehead, not from fear, but from the weight of self-restraint. She glanced at Whoopi, not with hostility, but with something sharper, clarity. That single sentence from Whoopi didn't just undermine Jasmine. It undermined every woman of color who had ever walked into a space with more intelligence than welcome. It was betrayal disguised as commentary. What millions of viewers thought ended as just another tense moment on television was, for Jasmine Crockett, the beginning of something much colder, much sharper, and entirely intentional. She didn't storm off the set. She didn't cry. She didn't even look back as she passed the snack table, the fake smiles or the posters on the wall claiming the view was honest conversation. Jasmine had already understood the truth. She hadn't been invited for a respectful discussion. She'd been brought in as a punching bag, but they had made one huge mistake. They picked the wrong woman. She walked down the hallway with calm steps, her heels clicking like a clock, ticking down to something serious. No one spoke to her. No one said goodbye. When she reached the elevator, she took out her phone, found one name in her contacts, and hit call. She spoke only 3 words. "We're doing this." That night, when Jasmine got back to her apartment, her legal team was already getting to work. These weren't press people or campaign workers. These were real lawyers, serious ones, who had worked on big national cases before. They didn't ask her how she felt. They asked her to describe what happened. What exactly was said? Who laughed? Did anyone behind the scenes encourage it? Jasmine answered everything calmly, clearly. She didn't need to look at notes. She remembered it all. And now every word, every look, every camera angle was about to be studied. They broke the video of the show down second by second. They looked at behind-the-scenes clips from the cameras that kept rolling during commercial breaks. One of her staff members had already asked for those copies, using a routine request meant for official records. The lawyers slowed the video, analyzed each host's expression, and noticed how the laughter was timed perfectly. Then came the shocking part, the messages between people working on the show. One message, sent just before Jasmine appeared, said, "Joy starts with something about her looks. Sunny will talk about privilege. Whoopi finishes strong. She knows what to say." That wasn't just a bad interview. That was a plan. 1 week after the show aired, at 9 o'clock in the morning, a man in a suit delivered a black envelope to the main office of the television network. Inside was a letter that said Jasmine was preparing to sue the company and the host for trying to damage her name and career on purpose. The letter included nearly 50 pages of proof, videos, emails, and even screenshots of private conversations from people who worked on the show. There was also a memory stick with everything organized and labeled. On the front page, one sentence stood out. "This is not about feelings. This is about showing the world what happens when powerful people humiliate others and hide behind the word entertainment." At the TV station, everything went silent. The top lawyers read the letter and said, "We're in trouble." It wasn't just a threat, it was real, and it was strong. Each point came with clear evidence. One lawyer whispered, "How did we not see this coming?" Another staff member admitted quietly, "Because we thought she'd do what the others did, stay quiet." But Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to stay quiet. The amount she asked for was huge, $800 million. That wasn't just a random number. That was how much the show was expected to earn over the next few years, multiplied to make a statement. She wasn't just asking for money. She was demanding change. Jasmine and her lawyers didn't just want to win. They wanted to show that you can't publicly attack someone's worth and walk away without consequences. Inside the building, panic spread. Producers were pulled from meetings. Hosts were told to stop interviews. One person even locked themselves in their dressing room. A junior assistant asked, "Can't we just apologize?" But the lead lawyer shook his head and said, "You can't apologize for something you planned in advance. This will go to court." Back at home, Jasmine sat at her desk, surrounded by papers. Her apartment was quiet, no TV, no noise. On her walls were pictures from her work in Congress, thank you letters from people she helped, and awards for her efforts to fight injustice. They tried to reduce her to a joke on live TV. They forgot she had spent years fighting harder battles in rooms where no one clapped. They mocked her career, but they were about to learn every detail of it in a courtroom where laughter wouldn't help them. Jasmine didn't raise her voice that day. She didn't fight back on camera, but with one phone call, one envelope, and 1 week of preparation, she turned a public attack into a legal firestorm. And for the first time in a long time, a national talk show was about to learn what real accountability looked like. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't stepping into that courtroom with just a hurt reputation. She was walking in armed with evidence so precise, so cold, it would leave no room for excuses, no cracks for sympathy, and no place for the guilty to hide. Her legal team didn't just come with paperwork, they came with a digital arsenal. The first blow was footage never meant for public eyes, behind-the-scenes video taken from the studio's secondary cameras, the ones that stay rolling between commercial breaks. In those off-air moments, smiles faded and real intentions surfaced. A floor manager was seen whispering, "She's stiff. Keep the pressure on," as a producer off-camera gave a thumbs up right after Whoopi's brutal diversity comment landed. The footage showed laughter that wasn't spontaneous. It was cued. Signals exchanged between crew members were clear, timed, and disturbing. In one clip, a camera operator chuckled and muttered, "This'll trend by noon," as Jasmine sat frozen, composed, unknowingly in the middle of a setup. The courtroom fell still as the video played, not like a montage, but like a confession. Then came the messages, internal, time-stamped, undeniable. Slack logs from the show's planning team were retrieved, authenticated, and enlarged for everyone in the room to see. One message read, "Let joy open with the appearance jab. She'll get the audience giggling. Sunny takes it to privilege. Whoopi brings the hammer down." It was written casually, as if lining up ingredients for a recipe. There was no debate, no concern, no hesitation. They didn't just plan to challenge Jasmine. They choreographed her humiliation with military-like precision. The texts were read aloud by Jasmine's lead attorney, each sentence striking like a gavel against the floor of the courtroom. A juror covered their mouth. Another leaned back, arms crossed tightly, eyes locked on the hosts. There was no misinterpreting these messages. They weren't opinion. They were intent. But it didn't stop there. The next piece of evidence came from a producer's notebook, pages recovered from a scanned copy saved in the studio's scheduling software. It wasn't labeled maliciously, just segment strategy, Representative Crockett. But the content was damning. Bullet points spelled it out like a script. Start light, shift tone by minute 4, challenge her credibility, make her defensive, break her rhythm, break her spirit. One line had been circled twice in red ink. Break her spirit on camera. The courtroom, already tense, now felt like it was holding its breath. That phrase didn't sound like television. It sounded like psychological warfare. Jasmine didn't flinch as the page was displayed. She had already lived it once. Now she was forcing them to watch it back. The final blow, the moment that seemed to shatter the last illusion of innocence, came through a short audio recording, raw, grainy, and unfiltered. A voice memo from the control room, captured by an assistant editor's phone, left recording by accident. The voice was unmistakable. A senior producer, laughing quietly. "She cracked. That's it. We got what we needed." There was no shock in the tone, no regret, just satisfaction. As if Jasmine's silence during the segment, her composed resistance, was the victory they had orchestrated. But now that very sentence echoed back across the courtroom like a weapon misfiring in the wrong hands. Jasmine sat through it all in silence. Not cold, but strong. Her expression was unreadable. Not detached, but unshakable. Across the aisle, the defendants looked smaller than they had on television. Less glamorous, more exposed. This wasn't a talk show anymore. It was a reckoning. And in this room, there were no commercial breaks, no canned applause, no producers to shout "cut" when things got too real. There was only evidence, and a woman they tried to destroy, now turning every cruel whisper, every laughing message, every gotcha moment into a nail in the coffin of their defense. With the courtroom silence still echoing from the last recording, she cracked. We got what we needed. The air around Jasmine Crockett changed. The damage was now undeniable, and those who once laughed behind studio lights began looking for shadows to hide in. It began with a phone call Jasmine hadn't expected, not from a lawyer or journalist, but from a woman she deeply respected, someone older, grounded, and wise, someone who had mentored young activists across generations. Her voice on the other end was warm, hesitant, but unmistakably careful. "Jasmine," she said softly, "Whoopi wants to reach out, personally." Jasmine said nothing. The woman continued, "She doesn't want this to escalate. She believes that you two, as Black women, can handle this the right way. No courtrooms, no headlines, just a real conversation, woman to woman." The message was dressed in kinship, draped in sisterhood, offered like an olive branch. But Jasmine knew better. It wasn't reconciliation, it was retreat. The same woman who had once looked her in the eye and said she didn't belong on that stage was now hoping shared skin color could erase shared harm. Jasmine stood at the window of her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, watching the city blur behind layers of glass and memory. Her voice, when it came, was low but certain, razor sharp through velvet. "Tell her this isn't about two women having a disagreement," she said. "This is about what she said with a microphone, a camera, and the full weight of a national platform." She paused, letting the words settle. "I wasn't wounded in private. I was humiliated in public." Her eyes didn't blink as she said it. There was no bitterness in her tone, only precision. She wasn't seeking vengeance. She was defending truth in the exact arena where it had been twisted. There could be no private closure when the harm had been nationally televised, rehearsed, and directed like theater. Then Jasmine added something the woman on the other end would never forget. "Tell Whoopi," she said, "if we were truly sisters, she wouldn't have sat beside me and struck the match." Silence lingered. A long breath passed through the line. Jasmine didn't wait for a response. She simply ended the call. The conversation, like the plea it carried, was over. What they had done to her wasn't a misstep or an awkward moment. It was a calculated betrayal delivered through smiles and applause, scripted down to the last beat. And now that truth was moving out of the shadows where it had been whispered and denied, into the light of testimony and consequence. Jasmine Crockett wasn't backing down. She was rising, on record in the open, and by her own name. But if Whoopi's appeal to sisterhood failed quietly behind the curtain, Joy Behar's move came wrapped in something far more calculated. Money, apology without admission, and the desperate hope that silence could be bought before truth reached a courtroom. The meeting was set in a private conference room at the Carlisle Hotel, one of those old Manhattan hideaways designed to whisper secrets between crystal glasses and silk drapes. Jasmine wasn't there. She didn't need to be. Her attorney, a woman as sharp as broken glass and twice as cold, arrived exactly on time, carrying a thin folder and nothing else. Joy Behar was already seated, flanked by two network representatives and an entertainment lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The mood was strained, as if everyone in the room knew they were there not to negotiate, but to plead. Joy, for once, wasn't performing. Her voice was low, her gestures small, her trademark sarcasm buried under a tight, forced smile. She opened by acknowledging that things got out of hand on set, that tensions were high, that maybe lines were crossed, but then pivoted swiftly to what she called a path to healing. It came in the form of a proposal, a discreet settlement, no courtroom, no admission of wrongdoing, and a carefully worded public statement expressing regret, but nothing more. The attorney listened without interrupting. No nods, no softening. When Joy finished, there was a brief silence, sharp and full of meaning. Then Jasmine's lawyer opened the folder and pulled out a single-page response, typed, signed, and ready. "Congresswoman Crockett has reviewed your offer," she said coolly, "and she declines." There was a visible shift in the room. Shoulders tensed, a pen dropped. Someone exhaled too loudly. The lawyer leaned forward, her voice now cutting clean through the quiet. "This is not about reputation. It's not about airtime or bad press. It's about dignity, publicly stripped, nationally televised, and deliberately engineered. She pushed the paper toward them like a final warning. You can't bury humiliation with hush money. Not this time. Back at her office, Jasmine read the summary of the meeting without a flicker of emotion. She had expected the attempt. What she didn't expect was how hollow it would feel. Joy Behar, who had mocked her face, her purpose, her presence, now wanted closure without consequences. Jasmine stood at her window, watching the city crawl beneath her. The world had always tried to make women like her choose between voice and peace, justice and survival. But this wasn't 1965. This wasn't a backroom deal made to protect legacy. This was her story, and she was no longer asking for space in it. She was taking it back. And while Joy tried to buy her way out with veiled regret and backroom settlements, Sunny Hostin, once the show's resident legal expert, was beginning to see the full legal noose tightening. And it wasn't just a bad look. It was personal liability. Sunny had built her career on credentials. A former federal prosecutor, a respected legal analyst, a woman who often reminded audiences she knew the law. But now that very knowledge was turning on her like a reflection she couldn't escape. As evidence mounted and Jasmine's legal filings grew heavier with detail, Sunny found herself in an unfamiliar position, not behind the commentary desk, but squarely in the line of legal fire. Her name was listed. Her voice was quoted. Her words, delivered with smug confidence just weeks earlier, were now being dissected, transcribed, and weaponized against her in real court, not the court of public opinion. The pressure broke through one evening when she sent a discreet email to Jasmine's legal team, bypassing her own network's lawyers. No signatures, no letterhead. Just a message. If Congresswoman Crockett would consider withdrawing my name, I am willing to issue a public apology and step down from the show indefinitely. The email was delivered, read, and forwarded. Jasmine saw it just before midnight. She didn't answer immediately. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then pushed away from her desk and stood in the middle of her quiet apartment, letting the weight of Sunny's offer settle in. It wasn't fear that moved her. It was clarity. This wasn't just someone trying to escape consequences. It was someone hoping to be spared because they now understood the pain they helped cause. But Jasmine remembered the smirk, the dismissive tone, the sharp-edged words. Let's not pretend she's here for her qualifications. That moment hadn't been a slip. It had been surgical, intentional. She sat back down, opened a reply window and typed just one line. The pain I felt wasn't selective. Neither is the justice I'm seeking. She didn't send a follow-up. She didn't elaborate. That sentence was her entire position. Pure, unshakable, and final. There was no escape clause in the contract of accountability. Sunny had made her choice in front of millions. Now Jasmine was making hers, in front of history. Sunny's quiet plea had been rejected, Joy's private deal dismissed, and Whoopi's back-channel appeal ignored. So now the last refuge for the View wasn't charm or secrecy. It was the courtroom. And this time, the lights were real, the microphones unfiltered, and there was no script to hide behind. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan hadn't seen this much media traffic in years. Satellite trucks lined the block. News anchors in tailored suits jostled for space outside steel barricades. The trial of Crockett versus ABC and The View wasn't just news. It had become a national moment, broadcast live across all major networks. Inside, the tension felt like oxygen had been removed from the air. Reporters whispered into voice recorders. Every movement was tracked. And then the room shifted because Jasmine Crockett entered. She wasn't surrounded by a swarm of advisors, no entourage, no PR handler, just a single black briefcase in one hand and that unmistakable calm in her step, like a storm had chosen to walk instead of thunder. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Her presence alone rewrote the power dynamic the moment she passed through the courtroom doors. The hosts arrived later, ushered in through a side entrance, heads lowered beneath sunglasses far too large for the cloudy morning. They didn't speak to each other. They barely looked up. The confidence they had once worn, like armor on television, now sagged beneath wrinkled blazers and overnight eye bags. Whoopi kept her coat on, despite the warm courtroom air. Joy clutched a stack of notes that looked untouched. Sunny moved like someone walking through a dream they couldn't wake from. The contrast was unmistakable. Jasmine stood like she had nothing to prove, while the women who had mocked her on daytime television now sat at the defense table, flinching each time a new face in the jury box turned toward them. The courtroom, once a stage for their laughter, had become a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into the courtroom, the weight of silence wasn't just anticipation, it was judgment waiting to be unleashed. But she wasn't there to plead for sympathy. She was there to unveil what had always been hidden, the cold, deliberate truth behind her public takedown. The room dimmed slightly, not out of dramatics, but necessity. A large display monitor was wheeled into position before the jury, its screen black and humming. The lead prosecutor stepped forward, clicked a remote, and the first video loaded, unedited, unfiltered, untouched by studio hands. The footage began not with the broadcasted segment, but with the raw camera feeds taken from before they were chopped into consumable sound bites. The jury saw what no home viewer had ever seen. Jasmine seated under glaring lights, her hands folded tightly, waiting as the hosts adjusted their earpieces. Then, the choreography began. At the exact second Joy Behar launched her condescending joke about Jasmine's looks, a camera panned in close to catch her reaction. It wasn't random. It was timed. Another angle caught Whoopi nodding off-screen, just as Sunny's privilege comment dropped like a cold blade. But what made the footage unbearable wasn't the dialogue. It was the nonverbal coordination. Glances exchanged, tiny smirks, producers behind the cameras mouthing, "Good, good." It was the anatomy of humiliation, planned, precise, and predatory. Then the visual switched. Onto the screen appeared a full-screen image of a chat log, blown up in high resolution for every juror to see. Timestamps glowed in the corner. 8:42 a.m., just 2 hours before Jasmine's appearance. The message read, "We need a viral moment. Jasmine is today's target." The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. Jurors sat back. The court reporter stopped typing for a moment. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was a direct admission of purpose. Not debate, not dialogue. Targeting. The prosecution flipped to the next message. "Let Joy jab first. Let Sunny hit the privilege angle. Whoopi closes hard. Keep camera tight. Make it look organic." The message was written like a battle plan. And Jasmine, a sitting congresswoman, had been the prey. The prosecution moved slowly, giving the jury time to absorb the weight of every word. Then came the final blow, a voice memo, recorded accidentally on a junior editor's phone, left running in the control room. The room dimmed further as the sound echoed through high-fidelity speakers. The voice was unmistakable, male, smug, casual, like someone commenting on a halftime score. "She cracked. That's gold. Run with it." 3 sentences, enough to shift the courtroom from tense to volatile. It wasn't commentary, it was a declaration of victory over a woman they had spent hours preparing to emotionally corner. And they had done it so casually, so efficiently, that her pain had been reduced to a marketing opportunity. The lights rose slightly, no one moved. Jasmine sat still, eyes forward. She didn't cry, she didn't nod. Her face was steel. But across the room, the hosts who once held the upper hand were now reduced to still figures behind the defense table. Joy's hands gripped her wrist until her knuckles whitened. Whoopi stared at the table, unmoving. Sunny looked directly at the jury, but her expression was empty, unreadable. The prosecution didn't need a closing remark. The screens went dark. The evidence didn't require interpretation. It wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. And in that heavy silence, the courtroom no longer saw a guest who had overreacted. They saw a woman surgically dismantled for ratings, for attention, for control, and now finally rising in the very place designed to shame her. When the final clip cut to black and the courtroom remained suspended in breathless silence, there was nowhere left for the defense to run. And yet, despite the damning evidence, the digital trail, the smirks caught on camera, the lawyers for ABC stood up, straightened their jackets, and tried to rewrite the moment as mere misunderstanding. The lead attorney for ABC took a slow breath before approaching the center of the courtroom, walking as though the weight of the evidence behind him hadn't already darkened the room. He spoke softly at first, his voice tempered, every syllable calculated to sound reasonable, measured, not evasive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, turning toward the jury with open, practiced hands, "what you've witnessed here, while uncomfortable, was never designed to hurt. This is The View, a talk show, live television, unscripted, dynamic, reactive by nature." His tone sought sympathy, a quiet pleading for perspective. "This is entertainment," he added, pausing for effect. "This is humorous discourse, not targeted attack." He turned back to the screen, now black and blank, as though its silence might help his argument. "These are human beings. These are unscripted hosts reacting in real time. Comments may land poorly, but that does not make them weapons." Then he repeated it, slower, louder, as if willing it to be true. "This is entertainment, not personal, not planned." But behind him, the shadows of every Slack message, every smirk, every voice memo still clung to the air like a film of smoke after fire. The courtroom was still too thick with the weight of the phrase, "We need a viral moment. Jasmine is today's target." Then came the fallback strategy, hollow and trembling beneath its polished exterior. These comments were small mistakes made during the rush of a fast-paced, high-pressure environment, the lawyer insisted. "In the world of daytime TV, missteps are inevitable. That does not make them criminal. That does not make them cruel." His voice faltered for just a beat, and the room heard it. A stutter, slight but audible, the sound of a defense unraveling beneath its own thin skin. But the damage had already been done, and no amount of carefully phrased excuses could unring what had already echoed across the nation. The jury didn't shift. The judge didn't interrupt. Jasmine didn't blink. Because calling it humor didn't make it funny. Calling it a small mistake didn't make it less deliberate. And calling it not personal didn't erase the target drawn clearly, coldly, and digitally around her name. The judge leaned forward slowly, folding his hands atop a thick leather-bound folder lined with printed transcripts and time-stamped exhibits. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It sliced through the courtroom like cold steel. "Counselor," he said evenly, "you've explained what you think this wasn't. Now explain what this is." A pause, then he gestured to the clerk, who tapped a key and projected a Slack message onto the large monitor, the glowing letters impossible to ignore. "We need a viral moment. Jasmine is today's target." The words sat in the center of the screen like a bullet hole through glass. "Do you expect this court to believe," the judge continued, eyes narrowing, "that identifying a guest as a target before they've said a single word is just a byproduct of live television?" The attorney hesitated. The explanation was already dead before it reached his lips. "Because what I see," the judge pressed, turning a page in his binder, "is a coordinated directive from production leadership, not improvisation from a nervous host." The tone was still calm, but it dripped with the weight of restrained fury. He turned toward the jury, then back to the screen. Another document appeared, a chart showing recurring segment patterns involving conservative women. Names, dates, and quotes were neatly organized in rows. "3 different guests," the judge said flatly. "3 similar setups. Same treatment, same format. Nearly identical language used by the hosts. Are those accidents too?" The courtroom remained painfully still. At the defense table, a legal assistant looked down at her lap. One of the hosts shifted in her seat, lips pressed into a line so tight it nearly vanished. The illusion of spontaneity had cracked, and now the fragments were slicing into their credibility. Then came the moment that redefined the mood. A voice from the jury box spoke up, measured, low, but sharp enough to cut through the silence like a blade. It was juror number 6, a former school principal in his late 60s, who had remained quiet through the entire trial until now. He leaned slightly forward and asked, not with anger, but something colder, disappointment. "If this was a mistake, why does it read like a checklist?" The room absorbed the question like a body takes a blow. No one answered. The defense attorney looked as if he might speak, but thought better of it. Even the judge didn't break the silence this time, because there was nothing left to say. It wasn't just one off-the-cuff comment anymore. It was a strategy, And the courtroom, once swayed by charisma and clever editing, now sat face to face with what had been engineered. A methodical plan to humiliate a guest under the guise of humor, executed with the precision of a media machine too used to immunity. The defense's final appeal to chaos as comedy hung awkwardly in the air, hoping to diffuse the calculated cruelty the jury had just witnessed. But the silence that followed wasn't one of understanding. It was one of disbelief. And the bench had heard enough. The defense had exhausted every justification, every loophole, every excuse dressed as explanation. The courtroom had witnessed not just a trial, but a reckoning. Now, as the jury returned, the air inside felt electric, charged with history, consequence, and the long-delayed weight of truth. The foreperson rose slowly, the paper in her hands trembling just enough to betray the gravity of what it carried. Every eye in the room locked on her. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the silence was so absolute it felt like the entire country was holding its breath in sync. Jasmine Crockett sat with a posture carved from stone, her hands folded, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed forward. She didn't flinch, didn't glance at her legal team, didn't look toward the defense table where the host sat in a half-collapsed row of carefully constructed silence. The judge nodded gently. The foreperson cleared her throat once. No performance, no excess, just the steady voice of someone about to read a verdict that would echo far beyond those four walls. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of defamation," she began, voice firm, words deliberate, "and of intentional harm to public reputation." The impact of those 15 words was seismic, not loud but total. It wasn't just a judgment. It was an indictment of a culture that had turned cruelty into programming and labeled it entertainment. You could feel the shift in the room, not a gasp, not even a murmur, just a palpable crack in the illusion of power that had surrounded the defendants until now. Joy Behar gripped the edge of the table as if anchoring herself to something real. Whoopi Goldberg stared at the jury with the frozen stillness of someone watching a house collapse in slow motion. Sunny Hostin closed her eyes just for a second, as if trying to disappear inside herself. Then came the final blow. Calm, clear, undeniable. "We award damages in the amount of $800 million. The words did not echo. They landed like stone on glass. A financial figure, yes. But more than that, a symbolic reckoning. It wasn't a number plucked from the sky. It was a direct measurement of harm, intention, scale, and national consequence. $800 million wasn't just a penalty. It was a signal flare to an entire industry that had long believed accountability did not apply to those behind the desk. There were no cheers, no applause, just the quiet devastation of reality settling in. And still Jasmine didn't move, because she didn't need to. Her composure had outlasted every smirk, every segment, every whispered plan. She had walked into that courtroom not just to defend her name, but to dismantle the assumption that voices like hers could be ridiculed without recourse. And now, in the stillness that followed the verdict, even the silence felt like it belonged to her. The verdict hadn't just closed a courtroom chapter, it opened a floodgate. And as the jury stood, and Jasmine Crockett remained motionless in silent defiance, the ripple began. But by the time it reached the studios of The View, it was no ripple at all. It was a tidal wave. Within hours of the verdict, ABC's upper floors were in chaos. Emergency emails flooded inboxes with subject lines in all caps. Crisis response needed, advertiser status update, shutdown discussion, urgent. The network's flagship morning program, The View, didn't air the next morning, nor the morning after that. No explanation was given to the public, no reruns, no guest hosts, not even a placeholder graphic. Just silence. A silence louder than any opening monologue the show had ever delivered. Inside the building, the order had already been issued. Indefinite suspension. Not for a week. Not for a review period. Indefinite. Executives who once boasted about the show's resilience now whispered behind locked doors, afraid to even speak its name in meetings. HR departments began scrubbing internal memos. Legal advisors urged silence. No one wanted their name on anything tied to what had become a scorched earth scandal. The fallout wasn't just internal, it exploded across media like a wildfire. Joy Behar, who once seemed to thrive on headline feuds and bold sound bites, vanished overnight. No appearances, no tweets, no cryptic quotes leaked to friendly outlets. Just a sudden, eerie absence, as if she'd evaporated in the smoke of the trial's aftermath. Even gossip columns couldn't track her. Her publicist gave no comment. Her social media accounts went dark. And Whoopi Goldberg, whose name once anchored the brand itself, disappeared with equal force. Rumors swirled. She had fled to Europe. She was planning a tell-all. She had been advised by counsel to go completely silent. But none of it mattered. Because what did matter was the image that now defined her legacy. Not of strength or sisterhood, but of folded arms and a carefully delivered insult. If it weren't for diversity initiatives, you wouldn't be sitting in that seat. That line had outlived the applause, and now it haunted everything she left behind. Sunny Hostin faced a different storm. While Joy and Whoopi receded into silence, Sunny was pulled directly into the spotlight, but this time, not on air. As a former federal prosecutor and legal analyst, her role in the segment took on deeper significance. It wasn't just cruelty, it was seen as betrayal from someone who should have known the line between commentary and character assassination. Days after the verdict, news broke that the New York Bar Association had launched an inquiry into her conduct. Whispers of disciplinary review became headlines. Former colleagues, once proud to cite her credibility, issued quiet statements of disappointment. Legal panels pulled her from guest slots. Firms distanced themselves. And what made it worse was that she had seen it coming. She had tried, however meekly, to exit the spiral before the trial even began. But Jasmine Crockett's reply to her private offer had been final. The pain I felt wasn't selective. Neither is the justice I'm seeking. And now Sunny was learning that truth in real time. Then came the advertisers. The exodus was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours of the jury's decision, 10 of the show's largest sponsors released statements, all using the same coded language. We are reevaluating our partnerships. But everyone knew what that meant. One by one, they pulled funding, not just from The View, but from ABC's broader daytime lineup. Luxury brands, tech giants, wellness companies, all fleeing a name now synonymous with strategic defamation. ABC's advertising department tried to salvage what they could, offering deep discounts, private assurances, and emergency rebranding plans. None of it worked. Because in the eyes of the public, the show wasn't just guilty in court, it was guilty on principle. Viewers who once laughed along were now posting clips in horror, dissecting frame by frame the moment Jasmine was set up and stripped of dignity in real time. Wall Street noticed. The network's parent company saw a 9% drop in stock value in under 48 hours, wiping out hundreds of millions in shareholder confidence. Financial analysts issued cold warnings. This may be unrecoverable in the short term. Media watchdogs declared it a turning point for daytime programming. News cycles that once celebrated The View as a cultural powerhouse now called it a cautionary tale. Commentators debated whether the show would ever return, and if it did, under what name, what hosts, and what soul. The answer wasn't clear, because the damage wasn't cosmetic, it was structural. Built into the DNA of a program that had, for too long, treated confrontation as entertainment and cruelty as content. Behind the scenes, ABC began triage operations. Crisis firms were hired overnight. Internal investigators were brought in to audit the communication chains. Who knew what, when, and who signed off on the pre-segment strategies that now lived in courtroom transcripts and national headlines. Staffers resigned. Others were reassigned. Producers scrubbed their LinkedIn pages. One mid-level executive reportedly walked out mid-meeting and never returned. The culture of untouchability that had defined the show was imploding, faster, louder, and more violently than anyone had anticipated. And all of it, every unraveling thread, traced back to one moment, the day they tried to humiliate a woman they never imagined would fight back and win. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. No press tour, no victory dance, no shouting on social media, because she had said what needed to be said where it mattered most, in court, on record, under oath. And the consequences were speaking for themselves. What had begun as 12 minutes of manipulated television had become a national reckoning. And now, in the ruins of a show once considered invincible, the industry had learned a new truth. When you manufacture pain for profit, don't be surprised when the bill finally arrives. The media storm exploded like wildfire across the country, drowning headlines with the collapse of The View, the silence of its stars, and the staggering $800 million verdict. But while news anchors speculated and social media danced in digital bonfires, there was one person who refused to celebrate. The courthouse doors groaned open as the crowd surged forward, pressing against barricades like ocean waves meeting steel. Reporters screamed questions from every angle, some desperate for sound bites, others just trying to capture her image. Flashbulbs burst against the overcast sky, flickering like lightning across Jasmine Crockett's face. But her stride never broke. Surrounded by her legal team, she descended the marble steps like a woman not escaping chaos, but walking straight through it, untouched. Her posture was steel, her expression unreadable. She wore no grin, no smirk, no expression of triumph, just the same determined calm that had carried her from the first insult to the final gavel. There was no podium, no waiting publicist, no official ABC mic flagged with a peacock logo. Just the open air of Washington, D.C., the city that had seen revolutions rise and reputations fall. The press expected a speech. They were practically begging for one. Dozens of cameras panned simultaneously. You could hear producers in the background whispering, "Get this live. Zoom tighter. She's going to say something." But she didn't raise her hands. She didn't hold a press release. She didn't even blink at the chaos. Instead, she paused midway down the steps, just long enough that every camera focused and every reporter hushed, sensing that something was about to be said. And in a voice clear enough to slice through wind and whispers alike, Jasmine Crockett spoke only 9 words. "I didn't retaliate. I reclaimed my dignity." That was it. No list of grievances, no scorched earth attack, no celebration. Just a line carved so cleanly into the moment it seemed to silence the air itself. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict of her own, a final word that said more than any headline could. She didn't raise her voice, but it echoed off the courthouse columns, bounced through camera feeds, and landed like a stone in the gut of a nation watching. Because in that one sentence, the public saw the full measure of what had just happened. They saw that this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration, about someone who had been mocked on live television, set up by a team of producers who saw her pain as entertainment, and yet chose to fight not with venom, but with truth. Jasmine hadn't come to humiliate anyone. She had come to defend something that had been stripped from her in front of millions. Respect. Behind her, the hosts of The View did not emerge. They remained hidden, shuttled out through underground garages and side exits like ghosts leaving the ruins of a crumbling cathedral. They had nothing to say. Not yet. Their silence was not principled. It was strategic. Legal teams were still reeling. Public relations advisors still writing drafts of statements that would never match the weight of 9 words. Jasmine descended the final steps. A child standing in the crowd, no older than 12, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed. "She didn't yell," he whispered. "She didn't even look mad." The mother looked down, then back up at the figure disappearing into the waiting black SUV. "That's what strength really looks like," she answered. "It doesn't need to yell." Inside the vehicle, Jasmine sat without a word. Her lawyer offered her a water bottle. She didn't take it. She was still staring forward, not at the crowd, not at the courthouse, but at something far beyond either. For her, the fight hadn't ended with the verdict. The real work, she knew, had only just begun. But the court had given her something that could never be bought, never staged, and never edited in post-production. Truth, sealed by the law, watched by millions, and carried on by everyone who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. In the hours that followed, her sentence was everywhere. Major news outlets plastered it across headlines. "I didn't retaliate. I reclaimed my dignity." Opinion columns dissected its tone. Social media turned it into hashtags. Protesters wrote it on signs. Young activists printed it on shirts. And somewhere in a quiet apartment far from the coast, a woman who had been laughed at in her own workplace paused her day, looked up at the screen, and whispered those words to herself like a prayer. But Jasmine didn't see any of it. She turned off her phone. She didn't check trending topics. She didn't respond to celebrity praise or political endorsements. Because this wasn't about performance, it never had been. It wasn't about ratings or vindication or career moves. It was about showing that the line between truth and spectacle still mattered, that the pain of Black women wasn't a punchline, that silence in the face of systemic disrespect was no longer the cost of admission to the table. And though she had delivered those 9 words for herself, their resonance traveled faster than she could have imagined. Legal scholars replayed the clip in law schools. Commentators who once dismissed her now cited her as the voice of a new era of accountability. Even critics found themselves disarmed, not because they agreed with everything she stood for, but because they could no longer deny what had been done to her. Still, Jasmine didn't change her tone. No media tour, no expose. She politely declined interviews with every major outlet that requested a one-on-one. She had said what needed to be said, and now her silence was not retreat. It was a reminder that justice isn't always loud, that it doesn't always come dressed in anger or flashbulbs. Sometimes it arrives wearing quiet resolve and leaves with only dignity in its hands. In the days that followed, some tried to bait her into more. Rival hosts offered her airtime. Book agents came with contracts. Late-night comedians tried to spin her quote into comedy. She declined them all, because Jasmine Crockett knew something they didn't. Sometimes walking away with your head held high is the most defiant act of all. And when the dust began to settle and the studio lights dimmed for good, her words still echoed, not just in courtrooms or headlines or speeches, but in the places power doesn't reach. In classrooms, living rooms, shelters, clinics, anywhere someone had ever been dismissed, diminished, or demeaned. They heard her, they saw her, and most importantly, they understood her. Because in the end, she had not burned anyone down. She had simply refused to bow. Jasmine Crockett didn't demand the world change. She simply showed what happened when it didn't, and in doing so, forced the world to reconsider its reflection. The verdict had barely settled before television executives across the country scrambled to their boardrooms like generals after a failed campaign. Legal departments were summoned at midnight. Crisis consultants were flown in from opposite coasts. Showrunners who once mocked behind closed doors now whispered terms like defamation liability and public interest scrutiny, as if speaking them too loudly might invite subpoenas through their glass doors. The era of punchline first, accountability later was over, and Jasmine Crockett had closed the curtain with one sentence and a courtroom thunderclap that was still echoing down cable news corridors. Morning shows that once thrived on ambush segments began re-editing upcoming broadcasts overnight. Bookers started attaching clauses to contracts acknowledging the guest's right to full review. Network hosts, once invincible behind prompters and laughter tracks, now sat in post-production sessions with lawyers, dissecting every off-the-cuff jab. You could feel the change not in words but in fear, and not the fear of controversy, but the fear of consequence. The industry had played with fire for years. Jasmine made sure the burns were visible. One executive at a leading network reportedly stood during a closed-door emergency meeting and said, "If we want gladiator fights, let's pay for helmets. If we want honesty, let's stop aiming for blood." The silence that followed wasn't disagreement, it was understanding. Jasmine's lawsuit hadn't just hit The View, it had drawn a line in the sand and dared every host in America to test their balance on it. Producers at long-running political roundtables began consulting with civil rights attorneys before drafting segment questions. Contracts were redrafted with new language forbidding coordinated ambush strategies or planned character breakdowns. In a matter of weeks, phrases like vulnerability protocol and integrity guest standard became regular terms of network policy. For the first time in decades, television hosts were being trained in something beyond delivery and timing. They were being trained in restraint. A late-night satire program, notorious for baiting its guests into moments of emotional collapse, quietly canceled 2 planned interviews with lesser-known political figures. In a leaked internal email, a producer admitted, "We can't afford another Jasmine Crockett moment. If we push too hard and they've got receipts, we're toast." The memo spread like wildfire across newsroom Slack channels. The term Jasmine Crockett moment became shorthand not for failure, but for reckoning. The most dramatic shift, however, wasn't inside boardrooms. It was inside households. Americans, especially older viewers, began demanding a different kind of programming. Letters poured into networks, thousands at a time, calling out tone, imbalance, and cruelty veiled as curiosity. Veterans wrote in about how they'd been dismissed by anchors on national TV. Teachers recounted segments where they were used as political props. Activists, once laughed off the stage, now reminded networks of their duty not just to ratings, but to truth. One media watchdog organization reported that guest complaints across live programming had tripled in a single month. But unlike previous years, those complaints were no longer ignored. Every recorded insult was now a liability. Every mocking montage, a potential lawsuit. Jasmine had walked through fire and left behind a legal precedent hot enough to melt decades of network impunity. Lawsuits that had long remained buried beneath NDAs and confidentiality agreements began resurfacing. A journalist in Chicago reopened a case involving a 2018 segment where a grieving mother was misrepresented as unstable. In Los Angeles, a former teacher filed suit over a panel show that manipulated her words to suggest racial insensitivity, words she never actually said. Jasmine's win wasn't just symbolic, it was kinetic. It gave the silenced a blueprint, and they followed it, filing motions with screenshots, recordings, text messages, and transcripts. Receipts of every time dignity had been traded for ratings. Behind the scenes, veteran anchors began declining the gotcha segments. One longtime TV personality reportedly told her staff, "I want to ask real questions, not set traps. If my job depends on humiliation, I'll find another job." Her words circulated internally and eventually leaked. By week's end, she wasn't fired. She was promoted to executive producer. But the real shift arrived when a new generation of guests began entering studio buildings, no longer afraid. They came armed, not with hostility, but with expectation. Expectation that their stories wouldn't be reduced to edits, that their truths wouldn't be sliced for commercial breaks, that they weren't walking into an ambush, but into a conversation. And if they weren't granted that respect, they were prepared to walk out or sue. And so it happened. Talk shows, once addicted to adrenaline, began restructuring, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. A major broadcast company unveiled a guest-first initiative, mandating transparency in how interviews were planned and edited. Public editors, once ceremonial roles, were now empowered to intervene if guests raised objections post-broadcast. A new department at one streaming giant was formed solely to investigate complaints of guest manipulation. And in a move that stunned the industry, one prominent panel show paused its season mid-run and publicly apologized to 3 guests from previous years, inviting them back, not for redemption, but for reparation. The message was clear. If you lie on camera, edit for shame, or bait your guests for clout, you may just meet them in court. Jasmine hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't demanded a crusade, but her name became a turning point, an invisible clause every producer now whispered before writing a segment script. She hadn't destroyed the industry. She had simply dared it to do better. And beneath it all, beneath the reforms and apologies and rushed legal trainings, there lingered a quiet fear, not of lawsuits, not even of reputation, but of one person, a woman who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't launched a press tour, hadn't gloated. She had just told the truth and watched the walls crumble around it. And as the cameras turned elsewhere, networks restructured and the headlines faded from red to black, one truth remained suspended in the silence Jasmine left behind. A truth that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with dignity. In the end, what Jasmine Crockett won wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was a moral referendum, not on her, but on a culture that had forgotten the price of public humiliation. She didn't walk out of that courthouse with fanfare or vengeance. There were no celebrations, no champagne, no sound bites crafted to go viral. She walked out with something far heavier, a lesson that echoed across institutions, industries, and living rooms. A lesson about respect and what happens when we treat it as expendable. For decades, the architecture of modern television rewarded ridicule. Humor at someone else's expense was called edgy. Interruption was framed as engagement. Guests, especially women of color, were not welcome. They were set up. Every raised eyebrow, every smirk, every carefully timed cut to commercial became part of a formula. One that turned discomfort into spectacle. One that praised a host's quick wit while cutting the mic of those who dared speak truth to power. Jasmine didn't shatter that system with fury. She dismantled it with restraint. Her lesson began the moment she chose not to clap back on air, even as insults rained down. Not because she lacked words, but because she understood that some battles aren't won in the moment, they're won in memory. And when she sat, composed and silent, while America watched her dignity mocked in real time, she planted a seed in every viewer's conscience. What if that were me? The lesson deepened when she refused private settlements cloaked in fake apologies, when she said no to hush money disguised as reputational repair, when she stood alone while producers, executives, and publicists tried to cloak an orchestrated ambush in the language of misunderstanding. Jasmine's stand wasn't a rejection of entertainment. It was a demand that we redefine what we call entertainment, and who gets hurt in the process. Too often, we're taught that justice is about triumph, that the one who yells the loudest wins, that whoever lands the last joke, the final punchline, the most viral clip is the one who owns the story. Jasmine taught us something more uncomfortable, more enduring, that real justice might be quiet, that it might look like walking out alone, without applause, simply because you refuse to be broken. And in doing so, she offered a mirror, not just to The View, not just to ABC, but to us, to every audience member who once laughed when someone was cut off, to every producer who booked guests not to understand them, but to corner them, to every viewer who thought conflict made for better ratings than resolution. Jasmine didn't just sue a show, she indicted a mindset. Her courtroom win marked the beginning of a wider human reckoning. That speech, no matter how controversial, deserves fairness. That platform does not equal permission to belittle. That diversity is not a checklist for optics, but a commitment to listening, especially when it's uncomfortable. She reminded the world that being invited to speak means nothing if the room is rigged to drown you out. In interviews months later, she didn't dwell on the money or the headlines. Instead, she spoke about her late grandmother, who once told her that silence in the face of mockery isn't weakness, it's witness. That standing tall when you're being laughed at sends a louder message than shouting ever could. Jasmine made that memory real for millions of viewers, for future guests, and for hosts now forced to reckon with the power they wield. But perhaps the most human lesson of all wasn't about rights or lawsuits or even race. It was about dignity, that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to strip another person of their basic humanity under the glow of studio lights. That if we applaud cruelty, we inherit its consequences, and that every moment of televised mockery becomes not just a segment, but a stain. Jasmine Crockett walked into that studio expecting discussion. She left with scars, and yet she never called herself a victim. She called herself a witness to what happens when people confuse entertainment with entitlement. And because she stood her ground, quietly, firmly, legally, an entire system was forced to step back and ask itself, when did we start confusing cruelty with courage? That's the legacy she left. Not a verdict, but a voice. Not a fight, but a framework. Not revenge, but restoration. And now in green rooms across the country, guests ask for full context. Lawyers scan scripts. Hosts think twice. Not because they fear a lawsuit, but because they remember her face, her silence, and that moment when a woman who was mocked for her presence owned the room by refusing to play their game. That is the power of principle. That is the weight of humanity when it is not surrendered. And that is the lesson the world can no longer ignore. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.